Why do we expect safety in a fallen world? I mean, really think about that for a second. The 20th century saw roughly 170 million people murdered. And that figure does not even account for the casualties of world wars or, smaller global conflicts.
Right.
That is 170 million individuals slaughtered by their own governments. The very institutions designed to provide safety and order became the primary engines of death.
It is staggering when you put the numbers out there like that.
Yeah, it is. Yet somehow, modern Christians walk around expecting a comfortable, pain-free existence. Welcome to Reformed Thinking, where we're doing a deep dive into the historical and biblical roots of keeping the faith.
Glad to be here for this one.
Today, we have a very specific agenda for you. We are looking directly at the introduction to John Piper's book, The Roots of Endurance. We are setting out to figure out how Christians finish well, how do they die well, and how do they do this in a world that, quite frankly, feels incredibly fragile, insecure, and, well, often completely overwhelming.
That is the core issue we are looking at today, and we need to establish our theological lens right away. As Protestant believers, adhering to the Reformed theology of the Westminster Confession, we view perseverance in a very specific light.
Okay.
We do not view keeping the faith as a product of human grit or, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps or sheer willpower. We view it as a sovereign gift of grace. God initiates it, God sustains it, and God ensures it.
So it is all on him.
Precisely. Everything we discussed today about keeping the faith rests entirely on that rock-solid reality of God's sovereign grace. We are not talking about white-knuckling your way to heaven. We are talking about a theological bedrock that holds you when your own fingers fail.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that terrifying statistic about the 20th century completely shatters the illusion we build for ourselves. Where did we get this idea that following Christ comes with a guarantee of a comfortable, pain-free existence?
It is definitely a modern Western invention.
Right. When you look at Piper's observations regarding the prosperous West, there is a glaring, almost absurd demand in our culture for a trouble-free life. It is an absolute non-negotiable demand.
Yes.
And when trouble inevitably hits, what is the reaction? People immediately look for a system to blame. They fall into a pit of feeling sorry for themselves. They spend every ounce of their emotional, physical, and spiritual energy just trying to cope with the disruption to their comfort.
Which leaves nothing left over.
Exactly. Absolutely. And the result is a completely paralyzed church. They have absolutely nothing left over for ministering to others because they are entirely consumed by the fact that their personal kingdom of comfort has been preached.
What's fascinating here is the sheer historical blindness of that modern Western expectation. The historical data should immediately rid us of this illusion of safety. The 20th century was a bloody nightmare.
Yeah, a total nightmare.
When you digest that footnote about the 170 million people murdered by their own governments, it forces you to realize that the baseline human condition in a fallen world is not suburban tranquility. It is brutality.
Wow.
And the 21st century has already proven that there is no safe place on earth. You cannot buy enough security cameras. You cannot live in a gated community secure enough to lock out the reality of a groaning, fractured creation.
That is heavy.
The theological disconnect between what modern Christians expect and what history delivers is staggering. Many churches grow up with the mindset that moving away from stress and moving toward comfort is just the normal, default state of existence. They treat comfort as a constitutional right of the believer.
But the Bible doesn't say that at all.
No, the Bible guarantees tribulation. Jesus says in John 16:33 that in the world you will have tribulation. He does not suggest it as a possibility for a few unlucky believers. He promises it as a universal reality. Golgotha, after all, was not a manicured suburb of Jerusalem.
Definitely not.
It was a place of execution, outside the city gates, marked by flies, blood, public humiliation, and extreme suffering.
I look at that disconnect and I think about how strange our modern approach is. It is like trying to play a full-contact sport like rugby or American football, but insisting on wearing a tailored business suit and demanding that no one gets your clothes dirty.
That is a great way to put it.
It makes no sense. Think about it. You step onto a field of play where violent contact, mud, and bruising are the entire nature of the event. But you are out there in a silk tie, acting completely offended and filing a grievance every time someone bumps into you.
Right. Complain to the referee about the mud.
Yeah. We step into a fallen world, professing a faith centered on a crucified Savior, and then act shocked, even betrayed by God, when we face friction. But let me push back on this for a second.
Go ahead.
If the modern church is filled with people wearing tailored suits on a rugby pitch, what happens if people refuse to voluntarily take what Piper calls the Calvary Road? Do they just get to stay in their clean clothes on the sidelines? Can a Christian just successfully opt out of the suffering and live a quiet, unbothered life?
Not at all. If we connect this to the bigger picture, God has ways of ensuring his people walk the path he has ordained. We see this explicitly in Acts 11:9.
Ah, yes.
In that passage, the early believers were quite happy staying in Jerusalem. They had a great community, they were sharing meals, the preaching was excellent, they were home-loving saints, entirely comfortable staying right where they were.
Which sounds pretty nice, honestly.
It does, but God did not let them stay in that comfort zone. A massive, violent persecution arose over Stephen. The men were being dragged from their homes, and God used that terrifying persecution to catapult believers onto the Calvary Road.
So he forced them out.
Yes, they were scattered as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, speaking the word as they went. God might just catapult us onto that road today if we refuse to step onto it voluntarily. The true Christian life means moving toward need, not comfort.
Moving toward need.
Right. It means putting oneself at temporal risk for the sake of eternal security. The trajectory of a genuine believer is always toward the brokenness of the world, regardless of the danger, discomfort, or stress that comes with it. If you try to build a fortress of comfort to avoid the Calvary Road, God is more than willing to dismantle that fortress to get you moving.
If the normal Christian life is fraught with danger, disappointment, and stress, if frustration and sickness are the norm, not the exception, then how do we keep from quitting?
That is the big question.
The sheer weight of that reality feels crushing to me. If I'm guaranteed to face headwinds for the rest of my life, the natural human reaction is to simply stop walking. This leads us into the theological mechanics of perseverance. And Piper points out a massive shift in his own thinking when he reached his 50th year as a professing Christian.
Which is pretty late in the game to have a massive shift.
Yeah, it really is. In his 20s and 30s, he assumed sanctification had a cumulative effect. He operated under the logic that as you grow older in the faith, gaining more biblical knowledge, building better habits, and achieving more emotional stability, the likelihood of walking away from the faith of outright apostasy would become incredibly slim. He thought the years of steady growth would act as an impenetrable buffer by the time he hit 50.
That is a very common assumption, especially among eager young believers. They assume they are building a fortress of habit, intellect, and discipline that will render them invincible to doubt later in life.
Right.
They think, well, if I just read enough theology, if I memorize enough scripture, my faith will run on autopilot. But the illusion of the iron will is a dangerous myth.
The iron will.
Yes. While growth in grace certainly brings stability so that we're not tossed around by every wind of doctrine, the human will itself remains inherently weak. It never graduates to a state of independent perfection in this life. In a severe crisis of faith, the will is the very thing that fails.
Wow.
The danger of drifting, of growing weary in doing good, is a severe biblical reality. Piper admits to knowing horrifying moments of absolute blankness. He describes waking up and feeling completely empty toward the things of God, moments that made him realize his absolute desperate dependence on God's mercies being new every single morning. He realized that a 50-year track record of obedience means absolutely nothing if God withdraws his sustaining hand for even a moment.
He brings in a lyric from the Robert Robinson hymn that I think you, the listener, will recognize immediately. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love.
A classic.
Think about your own mornings. Consider those times you wake up, and before your feet even hit the floor, you feel like you are standing on the precipice of coldness. You feel an absolute blankness toward the things of God.
Yes, I think we all know that feeling.
You feel no natural inclination to pray, no desire to read the word, no affection for Christ. Your mind immediately runs toward your anxieties, your ambitions, or just a desire to go back to sleep. So what does this all mean? It means we absolutely cannot trust our own resolve. Our willpower is a fragile thread, not a heavy iron anchor.
This raises a critical question about human nature, and we have to tie this explicitly to the Reformed doctrine of total depravity. For a lay audience, we need to clarify what total depravity actually means, because it is frequently misunderstood.
Oh, heavily misunderstood.
It does not mean humans are as wicked as they could possibly be in every single action. It means every part of our nature, every faculty, our mind, our emotions, and crucially, our will is broken and tainted by the fall. There is no pristine, unaffected zone inside of us that can independently choose God and sustain that choice flawlessly.
Right.
Because our will is broken at the root, If keeping the faith depended decisively on us, we would all fall. We would all wander off the precipice on a random Tuesday morning. The fact that any believer wakes up still believing, still possessing a mustard seed of faith, is sheer, unadulterated mercy.
That is wild to think about.
The human will cannot be depended on to save itself or keep itself saved. Therefore, perseverance is an absolute gift. God must actively seize the weak and failing will and bring it back to himself in faith, day after day.
But hold on, I need to play the skeptic here. If our will is completely insufficient, and if we are prone to wander the second we rely on our own strength, how does this actually play out in real time? Who seizes our will and brings it back to God? And if God is doing all the seizing, what are we supposed to do? Just wait around.
Good questions.
This introduces the absolute necessity of desperate prayer. We are not talking about gentle, polite requests before a meal. We are talking about warfare. The way we should pray involves desperate pleading. We should be crying out, "Defeat every rising rebellion in my heart. Expose every demonic deception trying to cloud my mind. Master me. Do whatever you must do to keep me trusting you."
That level of intensity in prayer is thoroughly biblical. It is rooted directly in the Psalms and in the Lord's Prayer itself. Think about the very first petition in the Lord's Prayer. Hallowed be your name.
Okay.
Many people read that as a simple acclamation of praise, like saying, your name is holy. But in the original Greek, it uses a third-person imperative. It is a desperate plea for God to act upon the world and upon our own hearts.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we are asking for divine influence to move human hearts from irreverence to joyful submission. We are begging God to cause his name to be reverenced, starting with the person praying the prayer, because we know we cannot produce that reverence on our own. And we see the psalmist praying the exact same way.
Right, the Psalms are full of that.
The psalmist does not say, I will now incline my own heart. He prays for God to incline his heart toward the testimonies. He asks God to open his eyes to see beauty in the Word. He asks God to unite his divided allegiances and to satisfy him with divine love.
I love the acronym Piper uses for those requests. IOUS, incline, open, unite, satisfy. It is a brilliant way to remember how dependent we are. We have to ask God to incline our hearts because gravity naturally pulls our affections down toward money, entertainment, and ego.
Yes.
We ask him to open our eyes because we can read the Bible and see facts, but we are completely blind to the glory unless he opens our eyes. We ask him to unite our hearts because we constantly live with divided allegiances. We want God, but we also desperately want the approval of our peers.
That divided allegiance is so common.
And we ask him to satisfy us because duty is not enough. We need the satisfaction of God to break the allure of sin. Without this specific daily divine intervention, nobody will endure to the end. But the theological engine driving all this desperate prayer is actually found in the Old Testament. We look at Jeremiah 32:4, which outlines the new covenant promise. God says, I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me.
It is an amazing verse.
This is staggering. God commands that we stand firm, but he actually creates the obedience he demands. He puts the fear in our hearts so that we do not turn away. He secures our perseverance.
That is the defining mark of the new covenant. Under the old covenant, the law was written on stone and the people were not enabled to keep it. The law told them what to do, but it gave them no internal strength to do it. But in the new covenant, purchased by the blood of Christ, God takes the initiative. He promises to do for us what he commands from us.
So he provides the actual means.
Yes. This is the bedrock of our asking for help. We ask God to keep us precisely because he has explicitly promised to keep us. Our prayer is not a shot in the dark. It is rooted in his guaranteed grace. When we pray those desperate IOUS prayers, we are simply asking God to fulfill the terms of the new covenant that he already signed in the blood of his Son.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the logical pushback is obvious. If God does all the keeping, if he is the one putting the fear in our hearts and securing our faith, are we just passive?
Many people jump to that conclusion.
Right. Are we just passengers asleep on a train, trusting the conductor to get us to the station while we do absolutely nothing? No. The biblical witness rules that out completely. I look at it more like a sailor in a massive storm at sea. Imagine you are that sailor. You are desperately working the riggings.
Okay, I can picture that.
You are pulling the heavy, wet ropes until your hands literally bleed. You are hoisting the sails with fear and trembling, fighting the crashing waves, trying to keep the ship from capsizing. You are exerting massive, agonizing effort. But here's the reality. Your pulling on the ropes does not move the massive ship forward.
Not at all.
The physics of the ship moving forward relies 0% on your bleeding hands. It is exclusively the wind of God's grace filling those sails that provides the momentum. You position the sails, but the wind does the work. We see this in Philippians 2:1-13. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure.
Such a crucial passage.
We strive, we pull the ropes, but we do it with a restful confidence because we know it is God's mighty wind, not our frantic pulling, moving the ship.
That analogy captures the peculiar nature of Christians striving brilliantly. The sailor's terrified of the storm, yes, but he is not terrified that the wind does not exist. We put out immense effort to run the race and fight the fight, but we do it in a very specific posture, in the strength that God supplies.
Right, restful confidence.
We do not tremble with the frantic anxiety of an orphan who has been abandoned to figure it out alone. We strive with deep restfulness because we are relying entirely on grace. The tension is real. We are commanding our bodies, denying our flesh, and fighting sin. But the engine of that fight is divine grace.
The engine is grace.
And the entire point of this dynamic where we exert the effort, but God provides the grace that makes the effort possible, is so that God gets all the glory. If we supplied the raw strength from our own iron will, we would naturally get the glory.
Oh, I definitely would.
We would stand before God and say, look at the ship I rowed across the ocean. But because God makes all grace abound to us so we can abound in good works, the glory belongs entirely to him. We merely positioned the sails. He sent the gale.
This specific type of striving, relying entirely on grace so that God gets all the glory, was not just some abstract theological concept debated in seminary classrooms. It was the exact engine that drove some of history's greatest social reformers. And that moves us to examine the lives of three historical heavyweights: John Newton, Charles Simeon, and William Wilberforce.
Three incredible men.
These men faced massive, relentless, vicious opposition, yet they kept going for decades. They did not burn out, they did not quit, they did not retreat to a comfortable suburb.
Their secret, their theological route for keeping the faith amid such hostility, was placing justification strictly before sanctification. The historical source frames this as pardon before action, or pardon before strength. To understand this, we have to grasp the concept of imputed righteousness.
Let's break that down.
Imputed righteousness is an accounting term. It means God legally credits his own perfect righteousness to our account on the basis of Christ's perfect life and sacrificial death, entirely through faith. We do not earn it, it is placed onto our ledger.
So it's a legal transaction.
Yes. These men understood that the cross of Christ is first the ground of our acceptance with God before it ever becomes the inspiration for our labor. That perfect pardon, that legal declaration of not guilty, must precede any attempt at righteous living, or the entire system collapses into crushing legalism.
Let's focus on Wilberforce for a minute, because his insight here is incredible. He was a politician, a member of parliament. He had no formal theological training at all. He wasn't a reverend or a bishop.
That's a layman, really.
Yet in his 1797 book, A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians, Wilberforce diagnosed the massive moral decay of Britain with surgical precision. He looked at polite, high society British culture and realized that nominal Christians had made a fatal error. They thought morals were distinct from doctrine.
Which is a huge mistake.
They thought you could have good British behavior, good manners, and ethical laws without the bedrock theology of justification by faith alone. They wanted the fruit of Christianity without the root.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Wilberforce diagnosed a complete reversal of the gospel order. The culture had flipped justification and sanctification. The polite society of 1797 believed that producing the fruits of holiness, being a good neighbor, acting decently, going to church, was the cause of being justified, rather than the effect.
They got it backwards.
They thought if they acted morally enough, God would eventually accept them. By trying to make morality the root, they cut themselves off from the actual grace needed to fight sin, and to fight massive, entrenched injustices like the transatlantic slave trade. Wilberforce argued fiercely that true holiness must follow reconciliation to God. It can never precede it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Think about the psychology of this. If you are fighting the slave trade to earn God's love, the moment you face a brutal political defeat in Parliament, your immediate thought is that God is angry with you.
Yeah.
Yet you are not good enough and you burn out entirely.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you just collapse.
But if you already possess God's love through a prior pardon, the political defeat is just a logistical issue on the battlefield. It is not an existential threat to your soul. If you try to make your good works the cause of your acceptance with God, you lose both the acceptance and the ability to do genuine good works over the long haul.
That is such a vital distinction to understand. They were trying to manufacture the fruit without planting the root. And Wilberforce saw that this theological error was literally destroying the nation's morality, because moralism has no stamina. It breaks under pressure.
It really does.
This rigorous focus on justification by faith alone didn't turn these men into rigid, joyless academics either. You might think that focusing so heavily on dense theological doctrine would make them cold, analytical debaters, but it produced the exact opposite. Resting on their pardon fueled a very specific kind of delight that sustained their incredibly long battles.
That delight is a central theme when we look at their lives. Charles Simeon had a very specific, demanding view on joy. Simeon believed a nominal Christian is content with simply proving the way of salvation. The nominal Christian is happy to just win the theological argument, write a good paper, and rest on their intellectual correctness.
Right, just checking the intellectual boxes.
But Simeon argued that a true Christian actually loves the way of salvation, delights in it, glories in it, and shudders at the very thought of glorying in anything else. Delight in the cross of Christ, an emotional heart-level satisfaction in the pardon of God, was not optional.
It was required.
It was not just a sense of dutiful, begrudging obedience that kept them going. Dutiful obedience will last a few years, delight will last a lifetime. It was the high-octane fuel for their endurance.
And they did not try to endure alone. We see an incredible historical network that sustained these men. Their lives were interwoven intricately. They fought as a cohesive unit. Newton was the older father figure of the group, the former slave ship captain turned pastor.
An amazing redemption story there.
We have this record of a private meeting on December 7, 1785. Newton sat down and counseled a young, wealthy, newly converted Wilberforce. Wilberforce was having an existential crisis, trying to decide if he needed to leave the dirty world of politics now that he was a Christian. Many people told him to become a pastor, but Newton told him to stay.
That was a pivotal moment in history.
He looked at this young politician and believed God had raised Wilberforce up specifically for the good of the nation, to fight the slave trade from within the halls of power.
The longevity of their respective fights is staggering when you consider the opposition. Charles Simeon faced 54 years of ministry at Trinity Church in Cambridge. And the opposition he faced wasn't just polite disagreement. It was fierce, personal, and humiliating.
Humiliating is the right word.
For a 12-year stretch, his opponents literally locked the pews. The pew holders owned their seats, and they refused to let anyone sit in them while Simeon preached. They locked the wooden benches.
That is just insane.
Imagine the psychological toll of walking into your workplace for 624 consecutive Sundays, and the people you are trying to minister to have locked the doors to the seats, forcing you to preach to an audience standing uncomfortably in the aisles while the benches sit empty.
I can't even imagine. Most pastors would quit after 2 weeks of that.
12 years of that kind of blatant weekly rejection would break almost anyone. And Wilberforce fought relentlessly against the slave trade and for the spread of the gospel, facing massive financial and political backlash. He eventually saw the British colonies in India open to the gospel in 1813. That victory happened 6 years after John Newton died.
Wow.
They fought grueling battles that spanned entire decades, and sometimes they didn't even live to see the final victories of their closest friends.
There's also this fascinating historical detail about an unknown emissary of grace. When we talk about history, we focus on the big names. But look at the role of Isaac Milner.
Yes, Mel.
He was a tutor, an academic, who actually led Wilberforce to Christ during a carriage ride through Europe. Milner was also a strong, vocal supporter of Simeon when Simeon was facing massive backlash in Cambridge. Isaac Milner is not a household name. Most people listening right now have never heard of him.
Probably not, no.
Yet God used this seemingly small, unknown figure to uphold the men who were standing on the front lines of history. It shows how God uses a vast, interconnected network of believers, many of whom will never be famous, to sustain his people.
It perfectly illustrates the dynamic we see in the Old Testament. Newton acted like Moses on the mountain, holding up his hands in prayer, intercession, and encouragement. Meanwhile, Wilberforce was Joshua down in the muddy, violent battlefield, fighting Amalek in the political arena.
That's a great visual.
Neither could succeed without the other. They survived the grueling decades of opposition because they utilized a two-pronged strategy for survival. First, they rested entirely on the imputed righteousness of Christ, ensuring their souls were safe regardless of the political outcome. Second, they leaned heavily on the fellowship of the saints. They needed the vertical pardon of the cross, and they needed the horizontal support of each other.
Which brings us to the crucial question. How do you, the listener, apply this today? We are commanded to be imitators of those who inherit the promises through faith and patience, referencing Hebrews 6.12. We are not just studying history to win trivia contests. We are studying it to survive our own trials.
Absolutely.
So let's briefly recap the progression we have traced. We started by violently rejecting the illusion of a safe, pain-free life in the prosperous West. We recognized the absolute failure of the human will to secure its own faith, acknowledging our total depravity. We saw that we must rest entirely on the new covenant promise of God's keeping grace, crying out in desperate daily prayer for God to master us. We learned from Wilberforce that justification must strictly precede any moral action, or we will collapse under the weight of legalism. And finally, we saw the absolute necessity of leaning on a community of believers fighting alongside each other, fueled by a cross-focused delight rather than grim duty.
As we conclude our time, I want to leave you with a final consideration drawing directly from the theology we have discussed. If the Bible guarantees that the normal Christian life involves frustration, sickness, and conflict, what if your current hardship is not a random accident?
Right.
What if it is not a sign that God has abandoned you? Consider the possibility that the exact trial you are facing today, the health scare, the financial ruin, the broken relationship, is the specific instrument a sovereign God is using to detach you from the idol of comfort.
That reframes everything.
What if he is using this pain to expose the myth of your iron will, forcing you to rely entirely on his grace, thereby sealing your will irrevocably to his? How might viewing your stress as a severe mercy from a sovereign God completely alter your reaction to it when you wake up tomorrow morning?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive on Reformed thinking.